Speaking of some hot takes, I mean, we talked about Kansas State, and I told you that we were going to talk about Kansas State later on tonight. I thought about talking about Kansas State a little bit later, but since we just had the power ratings reveal and we saw Kansas State in there, let's just go ahead and dive right into it. We're gonna dive in like Trey Songz. I'm gonna dive in. Kansas State, we seen them boys. They were at home and they were taking on a TCU team. A TCU team that was coming off of a pretty impressive win, actually. TCU broke their two-game losing streak. They blew out BYU by 30 plus. Their quarterback for TCU ended up getting Josh Hoover. Josh Hoover for TCU had an impressive performance. I believe he was like Big 12 Offensive Player of the Week in their conference. And he came down to earth very, very quickly. He was making his second career start against his Kansas State team. First start on the road for that young man playing quarterback for TCU. And it went horribly wrong. It went completely, absolutely wrong. Anything that could have went wrong for TCU, it went wrong for TCU. And for Kansas State, anything that Kansas State wanted to do, Kansas State was able to get it done. I mean, first and foremost, Kansas State, right out the gate, they started off red hot. They were red hot in this game. Starting off a 21-point outburst in the first quarter, built a significant gap between them and TCU. And then, after that, just never looked back. They never left their foot off the gas pedal just in that first quarter alone. Now, this is a key stat here in this Kansas State and TCU game. This is what really shocked me. Not that Kansas State won, but the way that they won. In the first quarter alone, this is one quarter of football. They had over 230 total yards on offense. That includes over 120 yards on the ground. And then, and then the whole game in general, Kansas State ended up churning out over 500 yards of offense. Also took really good care of the football. They did not turn the football over. They had 29 first downs, boys. 29 first downs. That is how you have yourself some ball control when you're constantly moving those chains. And oh boy, did they move those chains quite a bit with those 29 first downs. They were able to dominate that time of possession as well. Kansas State nearly had 40 minutes of the ball in their hands. TCU, on the other hand, hardly had it for 21 minutes. And when they did have it for those 21 minutes, oh boy, they were not very good with it. So what else happened in this game? Kansas State, they had their two quarterback system. They had Will Howard play for quite some time, but Will Howard was not the only quarterback that played for Kansas State, and it wasn't one of those things where, okay, it was a blowout. Let's see what we have in our younger players / our backups so that they can get valuable game experience for the future. Nah, it was not like that at all. Both quarterbacks for Kansas State that came into the game came in for meaningful playing time when the game was actually not completely in hand, right? So Will Howard, he's been starting for this Kansas State team throughout the course of his year, and he was solid. He's not a liquid or a gas by any means. 10 for 16, 154, 3 touchdowns. Also has 62 yards at the ground. He started the game, but then they also used his freshman quarterback, Avery Johnson, the freshman out of Wichita, Kansas, and he wasn't too bad either. He certainly provided them a little bit of a spark there. That's a big reason why they were able to win convincingly against Texas Tech. He's earned playing time, even as a freshman. 5 for 10, 90 yards and a touchdown. Also, he carried the rock quite a bit, and TCU, quite honestly, didn't really have an answer either. 73 yards on the ground. That's pretty good from their quarterback. So between Avery Johnson and Will Howard, they had over 100 yards on the ground. That's getting it done in terms of being dual threat quarterbacks. When both quarterbacks that come into the game end up being extraordinarily effective and also being extraordinarily effective with that ground game. They were both dual threats, and TCU was completely lost on defense, and they just never had they just never really were able to get things going on either side of the ball. And speaking of that other side of the ball, let's go back to Josh Hoover. Josh Hoover came back to earth. Josh Hoover, the quarterback for TCU, he had an excellent game last week against BYU, threw for over 400 yards. We talked about it on this podcast last week. We talked about TCU being a surprise in a pleasant way when they blew out BYU. They're not feeling the same way this week. Hoover barely completed half of his passes. He threw an interception, and the Horned Frogs, they were held to just like 300 yards of offense. It was their lowest total that they had the entire season. And it was surprising in the sense because TCU offensively has been a very explosive unit. TCU came into this game averaging over 400 yards. They're actually, close to 500 yards per contest through the first 7 games. Their unit just struggled to generate much momentum. And it wasn't even just on it was on all downs. First down, second down, third down. It was all bad. It was all dumpster fire. For example, Horned Frogs went just 2 for 13 on third down. So when they were brought in third down situations, Kansas State's defense was doing an effective job of getting them on the field. Not to mention that defense was getting hit hard early and often. There's no answers for that 2 quarterback mix that Kansas State is starting to employ. Amani Bailey was a bright spot in this game for TCU. He did rush for over 100 yards, and it's his 5th career 100-yard game. He accounted for the vast majority of their rushing yards because TCU only had like 113 yards on the ground. Best drive for TCU was when the game was completely out of hand. They ended up with 16 plays, 73-yard drive, and that didn't even lead to any points because the clock expired before they could get across the end zone. So, hate to see it. And I'm sure it also helps that Kansas State's able to enjoy some nice home cooking at the same time soon. Because this is the first time in almost a month that Kansas State actually had an opportunity to be at home. Their last home game before this was against UCF, a game in which they won, and then between byes and being on a 2-game road trip, they were on the road against Oklahoma State and Texas Tech as well. Those 2 teams, it's been a while, is what I'm trying to say. So they probably do enjoy being back. And I just think that TCU, I just don't think they're a team I don't think they're a good road team at all. And that's evident. This is just the second time this season that TCU has left the state of Texas. They only have one more game outside of Texas this year. That is when they go to Oklahoma for their regular season finale. So what's next for these 2 teams in particular? So TCU, they're going to take on Texas Tech in Lubbock, but they will have a bye. So we'll have a couple weeks to prepare for that Texas Tech game. They do have a 4-game winning streak over the Red Raiders. Can they maintain that? Can they find a way to win on the road? Because in their road games, they're just 1-2 thus far this season. It's been a struggle for them. They've lost their last 2 road games in conference play specifically. Can they get their first such road win in Big 12 action? We'll see if TCU can right the ship. But keep in mind, Texas Tech is also going to be on bye. So TCU may have a couple of weeks to get ready for Texas Tech, but Texas Tech, likewise, they are going to have a couple of weeks to get ready for TCU too. So don't know if that's much of an advantage for TCU other than just trying to get healthier and getting guys less banged up. Kansas State, on the other hand, they're actually playing this week. They're actually playing this weekend. They're taking on Houston. Houston, a newcomer to the Big 12, and it's actually the very first time that these two teams played on a football field against each other. So history being made for those two teams facing against each other for the first time in their respective programs. Wishing both teams the best and getting that early 1-0 series lead against the other team. But Kansas State riding hot right now. But Houston is no slouch either, even though they're 1-3 in conference play. They just took Texas to the brink just this past weekend. Should be an interesting game.